5 deputies went into an abandoned industrial corridor outside Albuquerque to move one federal prisoner. Only one radio transmission came back out, and it wasn't in English. Case File 19 begins with a transport manifest that should never have existed. In August of 1996, Deputy U.S. Marshal Brandy Sheldon led a 5-person Special Operations Group element through the industrial corridor east of Albuquerque, escorting a federal detainee named Samuel Suburn toward a secure holding facility near Kirtland. The paperwork listed Suburn as a fugitive wanted on interstate fraud charges. The transport number stenciled on his jumpsuit did not match any fraud case on record. Sheldon noticed the discrepancy 12 minutes before the convoy lost radio contact with dispatch, and she said nothing, because saying something meant admitting she already suspected the mission was not what she had been told. She had requisitioned the route herself, a decision she would later regret without ever being able to explain why. Standard protocol called for the interstate, a straight run north with highway patrol backup staged every 20 miles. Instead, a redirect had come down through channels she couldn't trace back to a name, routing the convoy through the decommissioned industrial corridor east of the city under the justification of avoiding a way station audit that, as far as Sheldon could tell, did not exist. She had signed off on it anyway, because questioning a routing order above her clearance was not something the service encouraged in a deputy still working her way back into good standing. The corridor itself sat abandoned since a zoning dispute shuttered its warehouses in 1991. A maze of corrugated hangars and dry loading docks pressed against the base of a shallow canyon. Deputy Butch Osery rode point in the lead vehicle, watching sodium floodlights flicker along power lines that should not have been active at all in a decommissioned district. He radioed it in as a minor anomaly. Deputy James Shaner, newest to the unit and eager to prove his worth on his first SOG rotation, cross-referenced the grid against utility records and found nothing. No provider, no account, no reason for those lights to exist. Deputy Dean Cover kept his K-9 partner settled in the rear compartment, running a hand along the dog's flank in the particular rhythm that usually meant calm on a long transport. Tonight, the rhythm wasn't working. The dog had gone rigid somewhere around the corridor's outer perimeter fence, ears pinned flat, a low continuous growl that Cover had heard exactly twice before in 6 years of joint deployments, both times preceding something the report writers back at the field office refused to categorize honestly. He logged it as elevated alertness and said nothing further over the radio, unwilling to be the deputy who called a full stop over a nervous animal. The convoy stopped when the lead transport's engine seized without warning, the block cracking as though struck from beneath rather than failing from where. Deputy Dean Cover's K-9 partner refused to leave the vehicle, hackles raised toward the canyon wall long before anything visible had moved. Sheldon called it a mechanical failure over the radio, watching Osery's face as she said it, because both of them had already seen the tear in the undercarriage that no roadside failure could explain. 3 parallel gouges, evenly spaced, driven upward through solid steel. Osery crouched beside the wound in the chassis and ran 2 fingers along the torn metal edge, feeling a smoothness to the tear that a claw or blade should never have produced against hardened steel. He didn't say what he was thinking out loud, not yet, but he photographed the damage twice before standing, a habit built from years of watching official reports get rewritten by people who hadn't been standing where he was standing. Shaner, watching from the second vehicle, asked if it was sabotage. Osery told him to keep working the comms and said nothing else, which told Shaner more than an answer would have. Sheldon walked the length of the stalled convoy once, counting heads, checking weapons, running through the short list of contingencies the SOG training manual offered for a total communications blackout in hostile terrain. None of them accounted for power lines coming alive in a district with no active utility account, or for gouges torn through hardened steel with a precision no animal claw should produce. She kept her voice level when she gave the order to proceed on foot toward the nearest structure, because a unit that heard fear in her voice this early in the operation would carry that fear with them for whatever came next. Power died across the entire corridor within 90 seconds, plunging the hangars into a darkness so total the deputy's flashlights barely cut 10 feet into it. Shaner's tablet flagged a communications anomaly first, a low, rhythmic interference pattern bleeding across every channel they tried, not static but something closer to a heartbeat. Osery moved to breach the nearest hangar for cover, shotgun raised, and stopped cold when his light caught the first pair of eyes. Amber, pulsing fast and irregular, low to the ground at the tree-line above the canyon rim, and then a second pair beside it and a third. Stubborn, cuffed and silent through all of it, finally spoke. He told Sheldon they needed to leave the corridor before the lights went out completely, and when she asked how he knew that, he said nothing else at all, which unsettled her more than any threat could have. She pressed him once more, closing the distance between them until their faces were inches apart under the dying flashlight beam, and for a half-second something crossed his expression that looked less like fear of the deputies around him and more like grief for a decision he had made a long time before this convoy ever existed. The first attack came not from the canyon rim but from directly beneath the lead vehicle, a shape moving on two legs at a speed the deputies' brains refused to process as biological, and the convoy's carefully rehearsed extraction plan collapsed in the space of 4 seconds. Sheldon's last coherent order before the formation scattered was to fall back toward the hangars, a command that would later strike her as the first of several decisions made under conditions where there had never truly been a correct choice to make. Only the one that let 4 of them survive the first 90 seconds instead of none of them. By the time the deputies regrouped inside the second hangar, they had lost visual contact with the lead vehicle entirely, and Cover's partner was refusing every command to move deeper into the structure. Sheldon activated the unit's night optics, expecting darkness to resolve into shapes she could plan against. Instead, the amber bioluminescence sitting in dozens of eyes around the hangar's perimeter overloaded the optic sensor array, washing every screen into blinding white static. Shaner tore his goggles off first, swearing under his breath, and it was his bare eyes that caught the true shape of what surrounded them. A fully furred, lupin-skulled predator standing upright at nearly 12 feet, its amber gaze fixed not on the deputies but on Stubborn. Sheldon counted 6 distinct silhouettes moving along the hangar's upper catwalk before she lost track, and every one of them adjusted its path the moment Stubborn shifted position between the deputies, a level of coordinated attention she had never once seen documented in a wildlife incident report. She keyed her radio out of habit, transmitting a contact call to a dispatch channel she already knew was dead, because the alternative was standing in silence and admitting to herself how far outside standard procedure this operation had already gone. This was the first contradiction that Sheldon's field report would later flag as impossible to reconcile with a standard predator engagement. The creatures were not converging on the armed deputies. They were maneuvering around them, methodically, toward the cuffed prisoner at the center of the formation, as though the deputies themselves were an obstacle to be managed rather than prey to be hunted. Osiri, forced into open sight lines by the ruined optics, put 2 shotgun rounds into the nearest creature's shoulder and watched it barely flinch, redirecting instead to knock him sideways into a support strut hard enough to crack his ribs. He went down hard against a stack of rusted shelving, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a single sharp exhale, and for 3 full seconds he could not tell whether the ringing in his ears was the shotgun blast or his own skull. Shaner reached him first, hauling him upright by the harness strap while Cover laid a covering line of fire toward the catwalk, and Osiri's first words once he could speak again were not about the pain in his ribs but a warning that the creature hadn't been trying to kill him at all, only to move him out of its path toward Stubborn. Shaner's comms tablet, still bleeding that same rhythmic interference, suddenly resolved into something structured, a repeating sequence that his training recognized half a second before his conscious mind caught up. Federal Morse. Not random noise, not animal vocalization mistaken for signal, but a deliberate transmission cycling through an authentication protocol used exclusively by U.S. Marshals Service Transport Control. Someone or something on the other side of that frequency was requesting a prisoner exchange using the exact procedural language taught in Shaner's own academy training 6 months earlier. He read the sequence aloud twice before anyone believed him because the alternative explanation, that something without a human voice box was cycling a federal authentication code with functional accuracy, was worse than any physical threat currently inside the hangar. Sheldon made him repeat the decoded phrase a 3rd time, watching Stubborn's face rather than the tablet, and it was Stubborn's reaction, not the transmission itself, that told her the message was genuine. He had gone the color of ash, and he would not meet her eyes. Cover's partner broke its lead and bolted for the hangar's rear exit, dragging him half off his feet before he released the leash entirely rather than be pulled into the open canyon beyond. Sheldon made the call that would define the rest of the operation. Fall back to the old water pumping station at the corridor's north edge, a squat concrete structure built to survive far worse than claws. Stubborn, walking now under his own power between two deputies, muttered something Sheldon almost missed in the chaos, that the pack wasn't hunting them at all, and that the real mistake had been made years before any of them arrived in Albuquerque. The run to the pumping station covered barely 400 meters, but it was the longest 400 meters of Sheldon's career, every step lit by intermittent amber flashes tracking their movement from both flanks without ever fully closing the distance, as though the pack was herding rather than chasing. Cover kept twisting to call for his partner even as Sheldon pulled him forward, and it was Shaner, uncharacteristically firm for the first time all night, who finally got a hand on his shoulder and told him the dog would find its own way or it wouldn't, but the four of them still had a chance if they kept moving. The pumping station's blast door sealed behind the four remaining deputies and Suburn with a weight that should have meant safety, and for nearly 90 seconds it did. Then Osiri, still cataloging the exterior through a narrow observation slit, called out that the creatures outside weren't attempting to breach the door at all. They were climbing the exterior piping instead, moving with a coordinated, almost engineering precision toward the exposed water main feeding the station from above, and Sheldon understood, one breath too late, exactly what kind of siege they had just sealed themselves into. Water hit the pumping station's interior in a pressurized sheet, the exterior main torn open in a single coordinated motion by at least 3 separate creatures working the joint simultaneously. Within 40 seconds, the floor was ankle-deep. Osiri abandoned his observation post to help brace the door, but the flooding wasn't coming from outside the seal. It was rising from a secondary intake valve buried beneath the station floor, one that predated the facility's decommissioning and that none of their briefings had ever mentioned existed. Shaner's tablet, still cycling that same Morse sequence, finally decoded far enough to render a partial phrase across the cracked screen. Return the sample. Sheldon stared at the 2 words longer than she should have, given the water already climbing past her ankles, because they collapsed every assumption she'd carried into this operation. This was never a rescue mission for a fugitive, and it was never a random predator encounter in a decommissioned corridor. Someone above her clearance had routed a federal transport directly into a retrieval operation and dressed it up as a fraud case, and the 4 of them were now standing knee-deep in the consequence of a decision made by people who would never have to explain it to anyone. Suburn's composure finally broke, and what followed was not a confession so much as a fragment he could no longer keep buried. He told Sheldon that 18 months earlier, a joint federal contractor operation had extracted a living specimen from this exact canyon under a classification he wasn't cleared to name, and that his transport had never been about interstate fraud at all. He had been the analyst assigned to that extraction, reassigned afterward under a manufactured charge to keep him quiet and moving through the system where no defense attorney would ever cross-reference his real file. The pack outside wasn't hunting a fugitive. It was recovering one of its own, and it had waited 18 months for the transport schedule to bring the one man who knew where the specimen was being held. Osiri demanded to know where that was, water now at his knees, his voice carrying an edge none of them had heard from him before. Suburn shook his head and said the location didn't matter anymore, because the people who built this operation had never planned for any of them to walk out and report it. The 3 deputies exchanged a look that Sheldon would later struggle to describe in words. Not disbelief, because disbelief would have required this night to still make sense by any normal measure, but a shared, silent recalculation of exactly how expendable they had become. Shaner tried the tablet's emergency beacon one final time, cycling through every frequency the unit carried, and got nothing back but the same rhythmic interference that had haunted every channel since the lights went out. He said, quietly, that whoever had rerouted this convoy through the corridor had likely disabled far more than the power grid. And Sheldon didn't answer him, because answering would have meant confirming a fear that was already climbing past her waist along with the water. Water reached the deputies' waists as the first amber eyes broke the surface at the station's flooded threshold. The blast door, finally giving at a hinge weakened by the pressure differential cover, had been fighting for the last 90 seconds. Sheldon gave the order to move to the elevated equipment platform bolted along the rear wall, dragging Suburn with them, while Osiri laid down suppressing fire into the water itself, the muzzle flash strobing amber reflections across a surface that would not stay still. Shaner lost his footing twice climbing to the platform, weighed down by the tablet and its useless cable rig, and it was Osiri who finally hauled him the last meter by the collar of his vest, shouting over the water that the equipment could be replaced and he couldn't. On the platform, the 4 survivors pressed themselves against the rear wall, weapons trained on a surface none of them could read clearly, waiting for a shape to break it and knowing, with a certainty none of them said aloud, that whatever surfaced next would decide who left the station and who became another line in a report no one outside this canyon would ever be allowed to read. The Alpha surfaced last, 15 centimeters taller than every creature around it, its slower and more dominant amber pulse cutting through the flare's chemical light as it fixed directly on Suburn rather than any of the armed deputies still firing into the flood. It did not attack the platform. It simply waited, amber eyes locked on the one man who could answer for the sample, until the station's remaining structural supports groaned under the combined weight of water and impact damage, and the entire rear wall began to fail outward into the canyon beyond, and the last clear transmission recovered from Shainer's tablet cuts off mid-syllable, precisely there, with no confirmed account of what happened in the 90 seconds after the wall gave way. Of the 5 federal personnel who entered the Copperline corridor that night, only Deputy Brandy Sheldon's official statement survives in the unredacted portion of this file, and it ends mid-sentence, cut off at the exact timestamp the water station's rear wall failed. The Justice Department's public record lists the incident as a transport fire with 1 survivor and no other casualties confirmed. Samuel Suburn's file was sealed the following morning under a classification that has never been declassified, and the specimen he referenced was never located, logged, or acknowledged by any agency that has since been asked. The corridor itself was fenced off within the month and remains listed as an industrial exclusion zone to this day. What happened to Osiri, Shainer, and Cover has never been officially resolved. Subscribe to The World Behind Midnight to uncover the next operation before it disappears. Because some secrets are best left behind midnight.